Hypnotic Realities, The Induction of Clinical Hypnosis and Forms of Indirect Suggestion by Milton H. Erickson, Ernest L. Rossi, and Sheila I. Rossi. Copyright 1976 by Ernest L. Rossi, Ph.D. All rights reserved.
Our book, Hypnotic Realities, is the record of a unique demonstration whereby Milton H. Erickson illustrates the art of inducing clinical hypnosis and the indirect forms of hypnotic suggestion. It is the record of a process of training and discovery. Initially, the senior author, Dr. Erickson, was involved in training the junior authors, Ernest and Sheila Rossi, in clinical hypnosis. As this training progressed, it became a process of analyzing the basic aspects of Erickson's work. Since the Rossis were beginners in the field, Erickson had to carefully introduce and demonstrate the basic principles of clinical hypnosis in a manner that makes this volume suitable as an introductory text to the field. Since Erickson is such a creative innovator, however, much of the material will be of great interest to all psychotherapists, whatever their level of training or field of specialization. It will be seen that clinical hypnosis and therapeutic trance can be regarded as carefully planned extensions of some everyday processes of normal living. Without quite realizing it, we all experience the common everyday trance, wherein we are lost or absorbed in a moment of inner reverie or preoccupation. During such periods of inner reflection, we go about our daily routine somewhat automatically. Much of our attention is actually focused inward as we experience ourselves a bit more deeply and possibly gain a fresh perspective or even solve a problem. Likewise, in the clinical utilization of trance, we can be more receptive to our own inner experience and unrealized potentials in ways that can be most surprising. With the help of a therapist's suggestions, these potentials may be explored and further developed in a creative manner. It will be seen that the hypnotherapist shares many views in common with other well-trained psychotherapists. An understanding of the dynamics of unconscious processes and behavior, an appreciation of the significance of emotional and experiential learning, as well as intellectual knowing, a high regard for the unique life experience of each individual, and so on. The hypnotherapist is different in practice, however, in that the hypnotherapist is more specialized in the deliberate utilization of these processes within patients to help them achieve their own therapeutic goals in their own unique way. In our book, Erickson demonstrates a myriad of approaches by which psychotherapists of all persuasions can facilitate psychological development with or without the formal induction of trance. Erickson believes that trance itself is a uniquely different experience for every person. Indeed, clinical trance may be understood as a free period in which individuality can become manifest. From this point of view, one comes to understand Erickson's work as an active approach to the basic endeavor of all psychotherapy. How do we help the individual outgrow learned limitations so that inner potentials can be realized to achieve therapeutic goals? Much of the uniqueness of Erickson's work may be attributed to what we may call the utilization theory of hypnotic suggestion. We can outline the utilization theory of hypnotic suggestion as follows. We view trance as a special state that intensifies the therapeutic relationship and focuses the patient attention inward on a few inner realities. Trance does not, however, ensure the acceptance of suggestions. Erikson uses certain communication devices, which we call indirect suggestions, to evoke, mobilize, and move a patient's associative processes and mental skills in certain directions to sometimes achieve certain therapeutic goals. He believes that hypnotic suggestion is actually this process of evoking and utilizing a patient's own mental processes in ways that are outside the patient's usual range of intentional or voluntary control. The effective hypnotherapist learns to use words, intonations, gestures that evoke the patient's own mental mechanisms and behavioral processes. Hypnotic suggestion is not a kind of verbal magic that can be imposed on patients to make them do anything. Hypnotic suggestions are effective only to the degree that they can activate, block, or alter the functioning of natural mental mechanisms and associations already existing within the patient. We like to emphasize that hypnotic suggestion can evoke and utilize potentials that already exist within the patient, but hypnotic suggestion cannot impose something totally alien. For Erikson, trance and hypnotic suggestion are separate phenomena that may or may not be associated in any given individual at any given moment. Because of this, Erikson has emphasized the difference between trance induction and trance utilization. In his early work, Erikson found it was necessary to spend 4 to 8 or even more hours in inducing trances and training the subject to function adequately before attempting hypnotic experimentation or hypnotherapy. As one gains experience in recognizing altered states and in utilizing indirect suggestions, however, this training period can be greatly shortened. The 8 sessions of Erikson's work with Dr. S. in our book are thus a typical example of training a subject to experience trance. It will be seen that trance is a highly individualized process that can be experienced very differently, even by the same person on separate occasions. For the therapeutic purposes of clinical hypnosis, however, we will focus our interest on exploring and facilitating only one particular aspect of trance. We are interested in that therapeutic aspect of trance wherein the limitations of one's usual conscious sets and belief systems are temporarily altered so that one can be receptive to an experience of other patterns of association and modes of mental functioning. We view hypnotic suggestion as a problem in communication and utilization. To facilitate suggestion, one must learn how to communicate more effectively. A major objective of our book is to isolate the hypnotic forms of communication that Erikson uses to facilitate suggestion. These hypnotic forms are communication devices that facilitate the evocation and utilization of the patient's own associations, potentials, and natural mental mechanisms in ways that are usually experienced as involuntary by the patient. Ordinary, everyday, non-hypnotic suggestions are acted upon because we have evaluated them with our usual conscious attitudes, and we find them to be an acceptable guide for our behavior, which we then carry out in a voluntary manner. Hypnotic suggestion, by contrast, is different in that the patient is surprised to find that experience and behavior are altered in a seemingly autonomous manner. Experience seems to be outside one's usual sense of control and self-direction. A successful clinical hypnotic experience, then, is one in which trance alters habitual attitudes and modes of functioning so that carefully formulated hypnotic suggestions can evoke and utilize other patterns of associations and potentials within the patient to implement certain therapeutic goals. This utilization approach to trance induction and the utilization of the patient's presenting behavior and symptoms as an integral part of therapy are among Erickson's most original contributions to the field of clinical hypnosis. This utilization approach, wherein each patient's individuality is carefully studied, facilitated, and utilized, is one of the ways in which clinical hypnosis is different from the standardized approaches of experimental and research hypnosis as it is usually conducted in the laboratory. It is in the clinician's ability to evaluate and utilize each patient's uniqueness, together with the circumstances of their ever-changing real-life situation, that the most striking hypnotic and therapeutic results are often achieved. The utilization approaches achieve their results precisely because they activate and further develop what is already within the patient, rather than attempt to impose something from the outside that might be unsuitable for the patient's individuality. Most of the indirect forms of hypnotic suggestion, which were pioneered by Erickson, were developed in clinical practice and field experiments without the benefit of detailed analysis or controlled experimental validation. In our book, therefore, we make a beginning in the process of analyzing a number of these indirect forms of hypnotic suggestion to achieve some understanding of their clinical application and to propose research that will be needed to further explore their nature and use. What are the indirect forms of suggestion? We can label some of them as follows. Most familiar to us, of course, are the use of questions, binds, and double binds. An interesting variation is what we like to call the double dissociation double bind. Less familiar is what Erickson likes to call the apposition of opposites. Erickson likes to carefully order the phrases in his sentences so that we have a whole scope of new indirect forms of suggestion that may be labeled as compound suggestions, contingent suggestions, suggestions covering all possibility of a class of responses. Included among these are what we might call two-level communication, wherein Erickson uses puns, metaphors, jokes, analogies to reach subjects at different levels. Erickson makes great use of classical procedures of dissociation. He's invented many unique uses of ideomotor signaling. Prominent in his approach is the use of implication and what we call the implied directive. From Erickson's early work, there's an approach called multiple tasks and serial suggestions. A common approach is what he likes to call not knowing or not doing. Erickson likes to give open-ended suggestions where just about any response can be accepted as valid. He has pioneered the use of pantomime and nonverbal suggestions. Very often he uses paradoxical intention. His dialogue is liberally sprinkled with partial remarks and dangling phrases that the patient's own associative processes will have to fill in. Erickson has pioneered the use of shock and surprise, and the use of voice locus and the dynamics of voice for what he calls indirect forms of suggestion. All of these forms of indirect suggestion and others are illustrated and explained in some detail in our volume. The subject of our book, Hypnotic Realities, was a psychologist and mother who was available to cooperate in a unique demonstration. To what degree was it possible to train a professional person to become a hypnotherapist by having her learn by experiencing hypnosis personally? Although trained as a psychotherapist, our subject, whom we will call Dr. S., had no academic or professional experience with hypnosis, apart from one demonstration where she experienced a short induction. This served to arouse her interest in the field, and she agreed to being tape recorded in return for the free training she would receive. Erickson initiates the process in this first session with what we may call the early learning set induction. He simply requests that she focus her attention on a spot while he talks with her. His approach is casual, gentle, warm, and friendly. Erickson simply talks about kindergarten and learning, imagery and comfort, the abilities of the unconscious, and some alterations of her blink reflex. This is an example of the conversational induction that can be so innocuous and indirect that it is often difficult to recognize that trance is being induced. The impatient tyro waits in vain for him to begin the hypnosis. Where are the mysterious manipulations that will take possession of the subject's mind and body? Where are the frenzy, prostration, stupor, the bizarre gesticulations that ancient medical lithographs have illustrated as possession in trance? Modern hypnotherapy is obviously very different from many of the popular conceptions of hypnosis as a mysterious drama. A therapist is not a showman. The therapist is, however, highly skilled in observation, so that the therapist is able to recognize even minor variations in a patient's behavior that provides important clues about the patient's interests and abilities. These cues are then utilized to help guide the patient into those interesting states of altered awareness that are generally called trance. Therapy then proceeds by taking the learnings that the person already has and applying them in other ways. Erickson is wary about suggesting or adding anything new to the patient. He would rather facilitate the patient's ability to creatively utilize and develop what is already present within. In this first session, Erickson introduces a number of themes that will be repeated in ever-widening contexts in later sessions. He focuses the patient's attention inward. He uses visual imagery. He frees unconscious processes from the limitations of a patient's conscious sets. He illustrates some principles and forms of indirect suggestion. And he introduces us to the ethics of trance and hypnotherapy. In this session, Erickson also demonstrates a variety of his indirect approaches. For example, the use of implication, not knowing, not doing, and of course the use of truisms. He demonstrates some of the characteristic features of trance and some of the ways he ratifies or proves the existence of trance. So subtle are his approaches, however, that the listener may have to read our commentaries to this first session in order to really recognize just what is happening. Here now is Dr. Milton H. Erickson in the first session of his trance training of Dr. S.
Look at the far upper corner of that picture. Oh, you, Dr. Rossi, watch her face. The far upper corner of that picture. Now I'm going to talk to you. When you first went to kindergarten, grade school, this matter of learning letters and numerals seemed to be a big, insurmountable task. To recognize the letter A, to tell a Q from an O was very, very difficult. And then to script and print were so different. But you learned to form a mental image of some kind. You didn't know it at the time, but it was a permanent mental image. And later on in grammar school, you formed other mental images of words or pictures, of sentences. You develop more and more mental images without knowing you are developing mental images. And you can recall all those images. Now you can go anywhere you wish and transport yourself to any situation. You can feel water. You may want to swim in it. You can do anything you want. You don't even have to listen to my voice, because your unconscious will hear it. Your unconscious can try anything it wishes that your conscious mind isn't going to do anything of importance. You'll notice that your conscious mind is somewhat concerned, since it keeps fluttering your eyelids. But you altered your rate of breathing. You've altered your pulse. You've altered your blood pressure. And without knowing, yes, you're demonstrating the immobility that a hypnotic subject can show. There is nothing really important except the activity of your unconscious mind. And that can be whatever your unconscious mind desires. Now physical comfort exists, but you don't even need to pay attention to your relaxation and comfort. I can tell your unconscious mind that you are an excellent hypnotic subject, and whatever you need to or want to, your unconscious mind will allow you to use it. it can take time, its own time. Letting you go into a trance, helping you to understand anything reasonable. I can speak to you or anyone else I choose, but only when I speak to you is it necessary for you to listen. I can direct my voice elsewhere, and you will know that I'm not speaking to you. So you will not need to pay any attention. Dr. Rossi, I think you see a lot of behavior of great interest. The alteration of the blink reflex, the alteration of the facial muscles, the total immobility.
Would you like to go on now and demonstrate more phenomena?
I might like to, but I do not discuss it with her consciously. Therefore, if I go on, I must first wake her up, ask her permission. The unconscious always protects the conscious. Would you like to awaken now? Notice the body reorientation when she came back. Now, is there anything you want to tell us?
Oh, I enjoyed it. It was very peaceful. I was watching a point up there, and it got foggy.
I see. A perceptual alteration.
Yeah, I tried to listen in the beginning, but then I went off to my own thing. It would have been tedious to listen to you, Dr. Erickson. I just felt like relaxing.
Thank you, Dr. Erickson.
This is the end of side 1. Fast forward to the end of the tape and turn the cassette over for the beginning of side 2.
Session 2 in the hypnotherapeutic training of Dr. S began with Erickson illustrating with simplicity and seeming casualness a few cornerstones of the indirect approach. He illustrates the yes set, implication, the double bind, and the use of truisms to align a patient's associative processes for creative trance work. In this second session, Dr. Erickson also illustrates the indirect approaches to discharging resistance, utilizing personal motivation to facilitate new learning and individuality. In this particular session, for example, Erickson talks about April. And April is the name of one of Dr. S's daughters. It will be very interesting to see how he utilizes that to heighten her motivation at one point during this session. Erickson takes some initial steps in this session toward training Dr. S for the experience of dissociation, ideomotor signaling, amnesia, visual hallucinations, post-hypnotic suggestion, and what he describes as the separation of the conscious and the unconscious. We witness a simple secret of the effectiveness of his approach. Dr. Erickson offers suggestions in an open-ended manner that admits many possibilities of response as acceptable. Suggestions are offered in such a manner that any response the patient makes can be accepted as a valid hypnotic phenomena. These open-ended suggestions are also a means of exploring the patient's response tendencies. Dr. Erickson will then utilize these response tendencies to effect therapeutic goals. Here now is Dr. Erickson with Session 2 in the trance training of Dr. S.
Both feet on the floor and your hands on your thighs, elbows at your sides. Pick a spot here on this paperweight. Now, the thing for you to do, actually for your own education, your own training, your own experiences, is to look at a spot there, anywhere you wish, and try to recall what I said to you, and keep on thinking, trying to recall a formation of mental images, of letters, numbers, the unimportance of keeping your eyes open, and then permitting Dr. Rossi and me to talk while you listen, and then beginning to drift away. Your eyes can now close, and you will note that drifting can occur more rapidly, that there is less and less importance to be attached to my voice, and that you can experience progressively any kind of sensation you wish. Bear in mind that when you first formed an image of the letter A, it was difficult. But as you continued in school, you learned to form mental images of letters and words and pictures with increasing ease until finally all you had to do was to take a look. In the matter of experiencing other sensations, you learn to recognize cold, warm, muscle tension. In your sleep at night, you can dream. In those dreams you can hear, you see, you move. You have any number of experiences. And as part of that experience is forgetting that dream after you awaken. An experience of forgetting in itself is an experience that is not alien to anybody. Now, with your background, you will have many questions about many things. You really don't know what those questions are. You won't know what some of the questions are until they are half answered. And sometimes the answers seem to be one thing and turn out to be another. The word April means a child. It means a month. But it can also mean April Fool. And so in your experiences, be aware of the fact that you really don't know where you are going to go, but you are going to go. It all belongs to you, and it can be shared in any way that you decide. And one of the nice things about hypnosis is that in the trance state, you can dare to look at and think and see and feel things that you wouldn't dare in the ordinary waking state. And it is hard for any person to think that he can be afraid of his own thoughts. But you can know that in this hypnotic state, you have all protection of your unconscious, which has been protecting you in your dreams, permitting you to dream what you wish, when you wish, and kept keeping that dream as long as your unconscious thought necessary, or as long as your conscious mind thought would be desirable. But your conscious mind will keep it only with the consent of your unconscious mind. Now, the important achievement for you is to realize that everybody does not know his capacities. And you have to discover these capacities in whatever slow way you wish. And one of the things I want you to discover is you don't need to listen to me. Your unconscious mind can listen to me without your knowledge, and also deal with something else at the same time. A person seeking therapy comes in and tells you one story that is believed fully at the conscious level, and in nonverbal language, and give you a story that is entirely different. And the unconscious mind has had little opportunity to give recognition to its own ways of understanding. We learn to nod our heads for yes, shake our heads for no. That is not necessarily true of all people. Cave people of the South Seas, recently discovered, have their own ways of nonverbal communication, or the cues are much slighter than we have. And your willingness to rely upon your unconscious mind to do anything that can be of interest and value to you is most important. Not only are you to learn positive things, but you need to learn negative things. One of the negative things you need to learn is that of forgetting. Consciously, you can say to yourself, this I will remember. To forget something seems very hard for some people. And yet, if they would look into their history, they can forget as easily. In teaching students in medical school, you tell them most impressively, the examination we held in such and such a room at such and such a time and in building C. And we'll begin at 2 o'clock. And they will all listen with great interest. And you turn to leave the classroom, and you will see the students lean toward each other and say, what day, what hour, building. You know they heard it, and they forgot it immediately. That is a facility in behaving and serves many good purposes. And you should enjoy learning to forget not only ideas, but nonverbal performances. Purposely forgetting that you know a certain name, doing you did as a child, when you decided you liked a different name, and perhaps for a half day you entertained that your name was Darlene or Anna Margaret. It's very remarkable thing to discover, that you can lose an arm, a leg, an entire moment. You can forget where you are. Now there are some different ways in which the mind can function, in which the unconscious can join with the conscious. Many different ways in which the unconscious can avoid the conscious mind without the conscious mind knowing that it is just received a gift. A very complexity of mental functioning. You can go into a trance and find out a whole lot of things that you can do. And there are so many more than you dreamed of. You can dream of yourself as a small child, wondering who that child is. You can watch that child grow older, week by week, month by month, year by year, until finally you are able to recognize who that child is who is growing up. Every person has abilities not known to the self, abilities discredited by the self. If there is an ability that the unconscious wants to disown, it can examine that ability. Examine it very fully, very completely, and when it desires, obliterate that ability. But doing so with an adequate understanding of the fact that an obliteration has been effected. Now I'm trying to map out some things you can learn. Now in hallucinating visually, sometimes you want to start it by keeping your eyes closed and knowing that they're closed. There is no set time for you to learn to remain into trances with your eyes wide open. You have already had some experiences of being in a trance with your eyes wide open. Now we'll shift over to another part of your learning. You can awaken from the trance at will. Awaken by counting back from 20 to 1. You can, as a person, awaken, but you do not need to awaken as a body. You can awaken when your body awakes, but without a recognition of your body. Our understanding of ourselves is very complicated. A child first learns, I love me. And then proceeds one day, I love my brothers, my father, my sister. What the child is saying, I love the me in you. And that's all the child does love, the me in you. As a child progresses, the child learns to love your beauty, your grace, intelligence. That is his perception of you. In the final stage, it is learning, in your happiness, I will find my happiness. And that is the separation of the identity of one's person from the identity of the other. Now what's happened to you?
Me?
Yes? What happened to you? You wait and don't discuss it. Because what you are going to do is to separate your understandings and clarify those and individualize them. At the present time, you have a partially conscious and partially unconscious understanding. And we don't know where to place the emphasis.
Thank you, Dr. Erickson. In this session, as well as others we have presented in our book, we find that Dr. Erickson is constantly facilitating patients' receptivity to their own inner associations and mental skills. These associations and mental skills will then be integrated into therapeutic responses. Ordinarily, this is very simply accomplished by Erickson when he tells a patient to sit in a certain way, focus on a spot, and remain quiet while Erickson talks. Erickson then embarks on a train of associations that will help the patient focus attention inward on memories, feelings, developmental patterns, and many real-life learning experiences. In this, Erickson is not so much suggesting in the sense of putting something into the patient's mind, as he is evoking. His words evoke pre-existing patterns of association and natural mental processes in the patient. He can evoke memories, for example, because the memories are already there in the person. He can evoke amnesia, anesthesia, dreamlike states, or any other hypnotic phenomena, only because there are built-in mechanisms for these processes already existing in the patient. Erickson watches the patient very carefully during induction. Induction is certainly not a standardized and mechanical procedure where he parrots some formula by rote. Erickson carefully notes where the patient's attention is all the time. The precise moment he chooses to begin an induction might be when he senses that the patient does need to focus inward and alter some of the limiting aspects of his conscious attitudes and belief systems so that therapy can proceed. Erickson understands trance as a normal experience of everyday life that occurs naturally whenever a person becomes deeply absorbed in some inner or outer reality. For example, daydreaming, listening to music, being absorbed in a novel, and so forth. Erickson notes the beginning signs of trance and then simply reinforces them in any way that is appropriate for a particular person in the here and now circumstances. Erickson has commented that he can recognize good subjects in an audience by noting those who exhibit relatively little body movement and those who have what he calls response attentiveness. Response attentiveness means someone who's becoming very absorbed in what another person is saying or doing. The moment when these characteristics are manifest in a therapy situation is obviously the best time for trance induction. If they do not become manifest naturally, then Erickson might initiate them by focusing and fixing the patient's attention with an interesting story, an anecdote, or whatever is motivating and absorbing for that particular patient. These interesting stories may seem irrelevant to the casual observer, but through them, Erickson is actually initiating a yes set and following behavior by the patient that will gradually lead into the induction phase proper. Erickson has described the state of response attentiveness as the common everyday trance, and he frequently utilizes this natural form of absorption just as he would a formally induced trance. Even without any form of formal trance induction, patients can become so absorbed in what he is saying that they later wonder if Erickson had somehow, without their knowledge, put them in a trance. Suggestions made while the patient is in this state of absorption can be just as effective as when in a formally induced trance. Trance thus need not be formally induced for effective clinical work. The approaches to clinical induction described in our book are simply convenient means by which the therapist can initiate a process of inner focus and unconscious learning. It is well that we speak of approaches to hypnotic induction rather than methods or techniques. Words like method and technique have connotations of being mechanical or hard and fast procedures that one imposes on a person in a standardized manner. Erickson imposes nothing. He simply tries to evoke the natural processes within the patient that will enable the patient to be receptive to his own inner realities and experience the possibility of new, creative work being done to resolve a problem. Erickson has developed a bewildering variety of approaches to these ends. As was illustrated in our book, he will frequently use a variety of these approaches in the same session. With each approach, he learns something new about the patient's characteristic ways of responding. He accepts whatever response the patient makes as adequate. How could it be anything other than adequate, since it is an expression of the patient's individuality? It is this individuality that will provide a unique solution for the unique problem that the patient brings to the therapist. Thank you.
This concludes Side 2.